They say that you should set a thief to catch a thief, as no one else understands the criminal mind better. Perhaps the most shining example of this idiom is Vidocq, the man who is now hailed as the father of modern criminology. He went from a life of crime, spent either on the run or in the prisons of France, to establishing a national detective police force that served as the model for Scotland Yard and others that followed it. He employed proto-forensic techniques such as ballistics and casting foot impressions. When he left the force, he started his own agency and became the world's first private eye. Vidocq goes against many of the tropes we have of the stereotypical detective. He was far from brilliant, and his success was more down to him being methodical and persuasive. He had a violent streak and was chiefly motivated by money. He made plenty of enemies during his career, as you are about to see, and his life was filled with almost as many failures as it was successes. Most of the information surrounding the detective's early years comes straight from the horse's mouth, courtesy of the Memoirs of Vidocq, the autobiography that he published with the help of a ghostwriter in 1828. So with that in mind, do feel free to take what we get from it with a generous helping of salt. Eugène François Vidocq was born in the city of Arras, in the Pays de Calais department in northern France, on July 23, 1775. He was the third of 7 children of Nicolas Joseph François Vidocq, a prosperous baker, and his wife Henriette François. He was actually born in the house next to the one where Maximilien Robespierre was born 16 years prior. The Vidocq family lived in a rough area of Arras called the Plat d'Armes, and consequently the young Eugène got into scraps at an early age. Fortunately for him, Vidocq had a large, strong constitution, and by the age of 8 he already bragged about being the terror of the children in the neighborhood. He also took up fencing when he was young, and by the age of 13 he was prodigious with the foil. Vidocq's life of crime, it started as a teenager, and his first target was his own family business. The youth worked for his father's bakery by making deliveries around town and would dip into the till money to spend at the pub. It was also at around this time that he began making the acquaintances of the city's local blackguards, cons, and other various villains. When his father discovered this, he began locking the till, but the enterprising Vidocq forged the key with the help of a blacksmith's son. When the senior Vidocq again put an end to his son's scheme, the offspring began simply stealing items and pawning them. This led to the first arrest and a few days in Bordeaux, the local jail. Instead of setting him straight, this experience convinced Vidocq to go for the one big score and then leave town. He broke into the bakery with the help of a friend and absconded with 2,000 francs. He split the money in half with his accomplice, and each went their separate ways. Early on in his life on the run, Vidocq learned a harsh but necessary lesson. There is always a bigger fish. He might have considered himself a successful criminal, but he was still naive in the ways of the world. While traveling through Belgium to secure passage on a ship, he met an affable stranger who took him to a house full of friendly, beautiful women. There, he was drugged up, and he woke up the next morning on the docks, half naked, with only a few crowns to his name. Vidocq was forced to take employment where he could find it, and so he joined a troupe of performers. He was treated miserably, beaten regularly, and he was given scraps for food. His appearance became so wretched that at one point he was asked to pretend to be a savage island cannibal who feasted on raw flesh. This prompted him to leave and join a group of puppeteers, but this new gig didn't last very long because he was kicked out for making eyes at his employer's wife. From there, he joined up with a group of traveling peddlers led by one Father Goddard. When opportunity arose, Vidocq returned home to Arras, where his father eventually forgave him. He enlisted in the army and joined the Bourbon regiment, where his reputation and his temper would often lead to fights. After 6 months, Vidocq had earned the nickname Reckless after engaging in 15 duels and killing 2 men. In 1792, France entered combat with Austria in the War of the First Coalition. Vidocq took part in several battles and was promoted to grenadier, but deserted after receiving a court-martial for hitting an officer. He joined the 11th Chasseurs under a different name, and although his desertion was discovered, a captain interceded on his behalf and all was forgiven. After being shot in the leg, the 18-year-old Vidocq, he was returned to Arras. Vidocq's years as a young adult seem to have been mostly divided between the prison cell and the army. On the rare occasions that he was free of both, he typically engaged in romantic trysts or felonious ventures. He even married once, but the relationship had ended rather quickly. His adventures took him to Brussels, where he presented himself as Monsieur Rousseau, follow, since Eugène Vidocq was once again wanted for desertion. In 1795, he joined the flying army and became a hussar captain. He caught the eye of an elderly widowed baroness who bequeathed him a generous sum that enabled Vidocq to live it up in Paris for some time. After a few months, the money was gone and Vidocq was back in prison. Here he discovered a new talent, forgery, and with the aid of a lover named Francine Longet, escaped several times but was always recaptured soon after. In just 5 years, Vidocq had been imprisoned in numerous places, not to mention once being shanghaied in Rotterdam and having a short stint as a privateer aboard a Dutch ship. In 1800, a 25-year-old Vidocq escaped prison and made his way back home. He found out that his father had died the previous year. He wanted to stay with his mother, but was recognized and he had to flee again. In Rouen, he assumed the identity of a merchant named Blondel. He was successful for a couple of years and planned to send for his mother before being discovered and once more having to go on the run. Time and time again, Vidocq tried to start a new life in a new city, but it seemed that everywhere he went, his past would soon catch up with him. In 1809, Vidocq found himself in familiar surroundings after being arrested and sent to prison. Undoubtedly, he could have escaped. He could have used a disguise or bribed the guards or even climbed the walls, and eventually Vidocq would have been a free man once again. However, he had grown very weary of prison escapes and the fleeting liberties they provided. He offered to put his experience and reputation to good use, and he became a prison informant. A police chief named Jean Henry accepted the deal and relocated Vidocq to La Force prison in Paris. It didn't take long for the prisoner to prove his worth. Vidocq made the acquaintance of Franz Thomel, a criminal who was part of a gang of prolific robbers. Although already imprisoned, it would not be long before Thomel was released due to lack of evidence or witnesses. Vidocq managed to gain his confidence enough that the felon revealed to him the residence of his mistress. Sure enough, police conducted a raid and found enough stolen merchandise to sentence Thomel to 8 years. Not only that, but the criminal still trusted Vidocq and gave him enough information to get his accomplices arrested as well. For 21 months, Vidocq plied his informant services between the walls of the prison. Eventually, Henri realized that he would be more useful on the outside, as he would be able to infiltrate many criminal establishments instead of just waiting for the criminals to come to him. They secured his release and made it look like just another escape. For the first time in a long while, Eugène Vidocq could walk the streets as himself without having to worry that the first officer who recognized him would try to arrest him. He wasn't completely a free man, though. Vidocq was a secret agent in the service of the state. His goal was to gather information that resulted in the prevention of crime and the capture of felons. His first collar was a counterfeiter named Watrin. In his autobiography, Vidocq pointed out that this was the beginning of a problem that dogged him his entire time on the force, as well as into his career as a private detective. All the other officers, they were jealous of his success and relished the opportunity to see him fail. Under the old adage of two heads better than one, Vidocq brought in some help and organized an informal unit called the Security Brigade to aid in his crime fighting. It consisted mostly of other reformed criminals like himself. Back then, France's police force, it was mainly divided into. There was the police politique, which was the secret police that handled covert operations and uncovered intrigues against the state, and then there was the standard man-in-the-street uniformed police that dealt with common crimes like theft, murder, and fraud. Crucially, Vidocq convinced his superiors that his agents should avoid the uniform and instead don plain clothes and even disguises to help them infiltrate areas that were otherwise off-limits to police. This group was a success. Less than a year after it passed, the Sûreté, that's the French word for it, officially became a unit of plainclothes detectives under the purview of the Prefecture of Police of Paris, with Vidocq as its first chief. Fortunately for him, the man at the top, Napoleon, was also a key recognizer of France's police force. He established the Prefecture of Police in 1800 and also increased the numbers and responsibilities of the gendarmerie, who up until that point functioned mainly as a semi-militarized force dispatched to keep the peace in rural areas of the country. Seemingly, Bonaparte approved of Vidocq's revolutionary approach to crime fighting, and a year later further expanded the Sûreté into the state security service known as the Sûreté Nationale. Vidocq trained all of his agents personally. Even when he had a few dozen men under him, he still enjoyed dressing up like a beggar and hitting the streets for some undercover work. His unit was responsible for hundreds of arrests and reportedly decreased the crime rate in Paris by up to 40%. According to criminologist John Philip Stead, in 1817, the Sûreté made 811 arrests, including 341 thieves, 46 forgers, 14 escaped prisoners, and 15 assassins. 1817 turned out to be a particularly fruitful year for Vidocq because he also received a full pardon for his past crimes from King Louis XVIII. Up until that point, although he was a superior officer with the Paris police force, Vidocq was still technically a wanted criminal. The following decade proved to be a more turbulent time for the policeman, both personally and professionally. He married again in 1820, but his wife passed away 4 years later, and his mother died shortly after that. In his professional life, Vidocq started to lose the support of his superiors. Jean-Henri retired, and the next police chief, Marc Duplessis, was not a fan of the Sûreté. Jules Anglais, the police prefect who obtained a pardon for Vidocq, also had to retire after failing to prevent the assassination of Charles Ferdinand, Duke of Berry. Finally, the king himself died and was succeeded by Charles X. Vidocq always maintains that the antipathy showed to him by other members of the police force was due to envy of his success. While there was certainly plenty of that, there was also resentment that a criminal would advance so high in the ranks without facing any serious consequences for his illicit past. At the same time, Vidocq became quite wealthy and famous during his career in law enforcement. He rubbed elbows with the Parisian elite like Victor Hugo and made enough money to start his own paper company. There were also unsubstantiated rumors that he continued his criminal activities, but now he just did it with the help of the law. By 1827, Vidocq had had one too many confrontations with his new boss. After 18 years on the force, the 52-year-old tendered his resignation to Marc Duplessis. The police chief was happy to be rid of him, although bizarrely he appointed as his successor another ex-convict named Barthélemy Coco-Lecoeur. Vidocq might have been a shrewd criminal and a pioneering detective, but he was not a very good businessman. It did not take long before his company went bankrupt, but on the bright side, the time off allowed him to put down his memoirs. By 1831, Duplessis was gone, and the new police prefect, Henri Gisquet, invited Vidocq back on the force. He was chief of the Sûreté once again, but his position was short-lived. Perhaps it was merely a symptom of the instability felt in France during the July monarchy, or maybe due to the cholera outbreak that was ravaging the country. But people showed little indulgence towards Vidocq and his group of ex-convicts. A few instances occurred in short succession where agents of the Sûreté were accused of acting as provocateurs against rioters, and some were even implicated in a theft. The unit's actions became harder and harder to justify, and by the end of 1832, Vidocq was once again cordially invited to resign. He did so by citing concern for the health of his third wife, who, by the way, was also his cousin. Following his departure, the Sûreté was purged of anyone who had a criminal record, even for minor offenses. The former agents didn't have to look for a new job. In 1833, Vidocq founded Le Bureau de Renseignement pour le Commerce, Office of Information for Businesses. Apologies for my French. For a fee, clients could access Vidocq's database of profiles on crooks and frauds. Should the need arise, they could also hire his agents to conduct personal investigations and surveillance into their interests, which often had nothing to do with business and instead pertained to private matters such as adultery or finances. Business information bureaus, they already existed, but because of the extra investigation services, many consider Vidocq's new endeavor to constitute the world's first private detective agency. Once again, he predominantly hired ex-convicts, many of them former agents of the Sûreté, since he had already trained them. If the rest of the police force had contempt for Vidocq before, now they loathed him. Many were not pleased with the idea of an extrajudicial group investigating crimes for the highest bidder. Accusations were thrown now more than ever that Vidocq and his detectives operated in a grey area of the law at best and did not shy away from a few illegalities to finish the job. You can't argue with the results, though, and the agency, it flourished at first. However, his quarrels with the true police force led to several arrests and seizures. The new police prefect, Gabriel Delasserre, was definitely not a fan of Vidocq and always looked for a new chance to crush his business. That opportunity, well, it arrived in 1842 when the prefect ordered a massive raid on the agency, which resulted in Vidocq's arrest. He stood accused of fraud and illegal arrest. Eventually, Vidocq was free again, but not before spending 11 months in prison. When he was released, he was 67 years old, and it became pretty clear to him that his best days were far behind him. He spent the rest of his life mostly out of the limelight, and he died in 1857. Vidocq laid the groundwork for the calling of the detective, but we should be clear that he was never a Sherlock Holmes-type character. He did not fit our image of the typical brilliant detective who gives brainy summations in a room full of suspects and revels in how the murderer did it while chewing on a lit pipe. If anything, he was more of a successful psychologist than he was a detective. He knew how to use his appearance, his reputation, and his attitude to get other criminals to trust him and confide in him. Another dull but practical ace up his sleeve was his obsession with keeping accurate and detailed records on all the criminals that he encountered. Vidocq often boasted of having an incredible memory, but he knew that his agents were not as gifted. Early in its infancy, the Sûreté began making index cards for the rogues in Paris, listing their physical appearance, distinguishing traits, prior convictions, modus operandi, and any other information that might prove useful. The system, it was primitive, but it worked, and it came in real handy later when Vidocq started his private agency. The Sûreté made use of it for decades until it was overhauled and improved by Alphonse Bertillon. This being said, let's not completely detract from the man's accomplishments, as Vidocq put his talents to good use in ways very few other crime fighters had done up until that point. He's had at least a handful of cases that would serve rather well for a Sunday afternoon crime show. On one occasion, Vidocq met early one morning with a suspected thief named Hasan. The latter looked tired, his clothes were wet and his boots were muddy. Clearly, this was a man who had had a busy night. Vidocq excused himself and went to inquire about burglaries that had happened the night before. He arrived at a crime scene and noticed a pair of footprints which made him think of Hasan's muddy boots. He had an agent fetch some plaster of Paris and he made a cast of the prints, which he then matched to the criminal's boots. Hasan confessed and he was sent to the galley. Another time, Vidocq investigated the notorious murder of Countess Isabelle d'Arcy. Everyone assumed her husband had shot her, but the detective relied on a primitive form of ballistics to prove the Count innocent. He had the doctor extract the bullet from the Countess's body, something he had to do in secret because it was highly irregular for that time, and he showed that the ball was too large to fit in Count d'Arcy's dueling pistol. Instead, Vidocq matched it to the weapon of the Countess's lover, who then confessed. Eugène Vidocq might be long gone, but his legacy, it lives on. His literary friends immortalized him in his books. Balzac based several characters on him, chief among them the criminal mastermind Vautrin. In his seminal work, Les Miserables, Victor Hugo drew inspiration for both his main characters, the convict and the policeman, from the dual life of Vidocq. The detective himself left behind quite a complimentary account of his exploits in the form of his memoirs. But perhaps no other tribute is quite as fitting as the Vidocq Society. Back in September 1990, 3 criminal experts met for lunch. William Fleischer was a retired Philadelphia police officer and FBI agent, Frank Bender was a forensic sculptor, and Richard Walter was a criminal psychologist. They started talking shop, and the discussion eventually turned to cold cases. The 3 men realized that their knowledge and experience could prove to be an asset to a detective who is stuck looking for that one little clue that could lead to a break in the case. Not only that, but they knew plenty of other people who could also lend their expertise. Thus, the Vidocq Society was born. The organization meets once a month at the Union League of Philadelphia. It has 82 permanent members, one for each year that Vidocq lived. However, many others have joined as special members by invitation only. They include forensic scientists, law enforcement officers, prosecutors, profilers, medical examiners, and psychologists. Seldom will you find more experts on crime gathered under the same roof. The members have lunch and listen to an investigator who is there to present a murder case. He is stumped, he's out of leads, and the trail has gone cold for years. He is hoping that the people there will have some extra insight. Members of the Vidocq Society offer guidance and advice, and in certain cases even travel to the officer's jurisdiction to take a more hands-on approach with the investigation. Over the years, the Society has concentrated its efforts on cold cases from small or underfunded police precincts where its efforts would have the largest impact. The Society first tasted success in March of 1991. The family of a murder victim named Huey Cox from Little Rock, Arkansas, believed that the man charged with the crime was innocent. Vidocqians agreed. 2 of them provided expert testimony at the trial, and the case was dismissed. Almost 30 years have passed since then. The Vidocq Society helped solve cases like the Arizona Canal murders and family annihilator John List. The group stresses that it doesn't want fame or glory, and indeed often there is none. The Society laments that not enough investigators are actually aware of their services and would like a bit more attention, if only so that they can work more cases and continue the detective legacy of Eugène Vidocq. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, give us a thumbs up below. Let us know what you thought of it in the comment section. Also subscribe and hit that notification bell. Why not? Also, I've got another channel. If you didn't know about it, maybe you want to. It's called Top 10s. I'm going to link to that below. And as always, thank you for watching.